All right, welcome to the first episode of the new Return to Virtue podcast that I'm running with my friend AJ Barker. AJ, great to have you here.
Will, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get started on this.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. So, really quickly, what we want to do is give people an overview of the tradition of virtue ethics. So, Aristotle and St. Thomas, which until recent years was really how most people understood their lives and what the goal of being a masculine man was. And it's what we need to return to so that people can get a sense of value and purpose and meaning again. AJ, what are your thoughts on this, given that suicide is currently the number one killer of men between ages 18, 45 to 50 ish? Most people don't know about that stat.
Yeah, well, I mean, for starters, virtue's the thing that when someone asks me, what do I most want for my children? It's not, a high paying job, good job, getting to some college or university. It's front and center. I want them to develop certain virtues and those primary virtues. I want them to be virtuous, and because it's really kind of that intrinsic goal that you can have that really has meaning. And Thomas Aquinas in one place says that the grace of calling is either to virtue or to faith. So for many people, where they're going to experience the call to the Lord is first going to come with just a desire to grow in virtue, to shed the vices, even if they don't really know much what that is. They might go through a Buddhist lens, which is like, I want to get rid of my attachments. Whatever it is, we want to shed the vices, and we start craving virtue. And that's my experience, is that most people in our modern day are getting the call through that
Mm,
lens, through
yeah.
a pull toward virtue.
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that virtue is the most important thing that we can develop in life, it's really countercultural because so many guys have been told that it's about how much money you make, for example. That's the real measure of you as a man. But of course, you can't take any of that with you when you die, right? But virtue is something that endures.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's like we all are yearning after happiness. That doesn't mean we all seek it well. And the fact that so many people are miserable, be it with clinical diagnosed depression, which I know people try and chalk up to not being the same as misery. But I mean, it is what it is. If you're in despair, if you're agonizing, which is going to be our topic today, but if you're depressed, you're not happy with life, and so you're still going after happiness. You're just going after it in a way that's making you unhappy.
Yeah, that's a really important point because we're going to talk in a minute about um, what it means to be happy and what things do fulfill us. But St. Thomas makes the point that um, we might not know that ultimately it's God that we're seeking. We seek happiness in all kinds of things to try to slake that infinite thirst that we have, but it can't truly satisfy us. So you get this pursuit of a kind of false infinity. Like the billionaire thinks, or maybe if I become a multi billionaire, then that will give me what I'm looking for. Everyone's looking for happiness, like you say, but not in the right place.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw this one in because it's one that I use with my students, teaching them, and I just is one that blew my mind when I realized it. But the act of the will, not to get too abstract, but the act of the will is to desire and go toward a thing. But then there's a second part that is to adhere to the thing desired. So the
Mm.
will goes toward it, and then it adheres. And so this is where Thomas says that what you try and adhere to, the object of what you try and adhere to, is going to determine the sort of stability of the happiness, right? So if what you're looking after is a really tasty food, well, as you go to adhere to it, the thing dissolves into you. So now it's gone. There's no fixity to it. And what, it gets closer if it's like your wife. And but then it also depends on how you adhere to one another. Are you going to be able to grow? Can you anchor it? Ultimately, the question, even for you to your wife, is it anchored in a desire and a process of trying to adhere to God? Because God is the only object that, as you adhere to it, is itself like perfectly not only just worthy, but overwhelmingly fulfilling to be adhered to, and is eternal and will never fade away. So you said it there, they look for the 1 billion to the next billion. Well, this is kind of the basis of addiction, is an infinite yearning that we have gets fixed onto a finite thing. And then because it fades away, our mechanism, and I'm guilty of it for many years, the mechanism is, oh, well, this finite thing fades away. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and approximate infinity by doing that finite thing over and over and over again. If I just do it over and over and over again, then I'll at least convince myself that I have something like the illusion of the infinite happiness I'm going after. But as we'll talk about, as we continue on through the show, it doesn't even come close to working.
Right. And this is what you see with the red pill community as well, with guys thinking that, oh, just one more woman will satisfy, just increase that body count by one. Whereas what they're really craving is the deep satisfaction of the love that you get in marriage with God at the center for the reasons
Yeah.
that you say. Okay, so let's get into this topic of despair in a bit more detail then.
Yeah.
So, what do we actually mean by it? And I'm going to put a controversial idea out there that the reason despair is so prevalent today is actually because, given the common worldviews that have departed from the natural law tradition that we're talking about, which has a clear understanding of human beings as being responsible, as being rational, human nature being a real thing that can be fulfilled objectively in a world that's not just created by God, but sustained by Him moment to moment. Once you take all that out and you say that human beings are just no different from other animals, or are just meaningless collections of matter that are getting bumped around according to the laws of physics with no objective meaning, value, or purpose, despair follows necessarily, right?
Yeah. Yeah, well, if we're just really clear about it, despair is something that's happened to your hope, right? Even before we get to specifics, that something's gone wrong with your hope, and hope is future oriented.
Hmm.
Well, if your life is only material contingent things that pass away, you fundamentally cannot but despair, because your future oriented, whatever your prospects are, whether you put it in your life, your happiness, the human species, the planet, the solar system, whatever principle, if you just expand it out, all these contingent things will pass away. And so there's something for modern man. And I was in this boat prior to my conversion, where actually started to see it with great clarity. For about 2 years, I had a sort of clarity around this, that man's condition was inevitably one of despair, inevitably. And that was because I did not have that eternal hope yet. I didn't actually yet believe. I didn't have the grace of God moving me to see Him and to believe that He's eternal. That it's literally a thing, that God literally exists. But so without that in the equation, without eternity in the equation, which is in God, then you can't but despair. There's actually no way around it. Now you might feel okay for the time being. You might be sort of anesthetized in the good things that you have going, the career pursuits, family, even any number of, you know what I mean. Maybe you're working on virtue in a sort of the natural virtues alone, and so you're working on your fitness and your
Mm.
health and all these things, and so for a time you can be distracted from it. But so long as you have a material worldview, that all that exists is material, which comes into being and then passes out of it, you're inevitably staring down the barrel of despair.
Yeah, because your worldview has no way of grounding any kind of objective meaning, value, or purpose. So, who's to say that any of your actions or your goals have those things either? Of course, they don't. But most guys don't want to actually put in the hard effort of thinking things through to a conclusion. So, like you say, they can be anesthetized, but sometimes they do actually wake up and realize the futility of it. And then you've got this hard choice. Like Paul says that the pagans are those without hope.
Yeah. Yeah, fundamentally, they can't, because again, there's nothing that would endure eternally. And if so, there's no foundation for it. Then it can't be that there can't be the hope. There can only be despair. And you kind of said too, it's like their actions then don't have meaning, all this stuff. Well, it's like it's in light of God and His informing us that our actions have meaning. He makes it so that our actions do have meaning, but then He also lets us know that they have meaning, and so we can then have confidence that they have meaning. And then you start to live it out, and you start to grow in charity and faith and hope, the theological virtues, and you start to get that taste of heaven here on earth, as the saints will talk about it, and as they model so well, certainly as their lives go, as they progress through their lives. But yeah, yeah, it's for that reason that now our actions have a meaning. It's because of their relationship to eternity.
Right. And you mentioned confidence there, which I think is really important to focus on because earlier we mentioned that despair is basically uh, giving up hope of being able to achieve some future good. You think that the path is just too hard. We've also clarified how necessarily when there is nothing to hope for at all, despair is going to follow then too. But confidence, that's interesting. So, what happens if we're too confident? That's
Yeah,
presumption, right?
yeah, yeah. Then we have the likelihood of falling into the vice of presumption.
So we've got to tread the middle way, which is what you're talking about. That we see the saints doing so well. They model for us. So it's not saying that life isn't hard. Of course it is. It has to be in all kinds of ways so we can grow through the suffering. But we have to persist despite that suffering and have a realistic idea grounded in our hope in God's mercy and the promises that He's made to us that the good can actually be achieved.
Yeah, yeah, and here I'm going to throw this example your way because I've used it before actually in lectures I've given to parents at school I'm at, and students in class. But it has to do with, again, with this virtue of hope and despair. And what I do is I use a natural example for them. So we're talking ultimately we're talking about the theological virtue of hope and despair, so in relation to heaven.
Yeah.
But it's good to sort of start to intuit despair as it is, as we experience it, in natural things here and now. So I use two examples. One is the pursuit of a girl you have a crush on, and the second is the interim period where you're interviewing for jobs and you don't have them. All right, both these things are for the most part, they're arduous goods. They're things that are difficult. They take work, and they take time. More than anything, they're just going to take time. By the way, a girl should sort of force the guy into some form of kind of despair, some form of time. And I think this is a very natural mechanism for women, for girls to do, which is to say, okay, this guy likes me. Let me just sort of do nothing for a little bit just to see how they react. For like, even if it's just a week, maybe it's a month, maybe it's longer, but it's kind of this gut reaction that is like, okay, this will kind of prove what's good in what they're doing and what's not. And so from our perspective, it's like that's the most agonizing time. You got a crush on a girl, you desire, love is a desire to be united to a thing. When you're willing the good of the other, it's because you want to be united to it, right? You have a desire for their good, and it's fundamentally, Thomas says, it's the uniting force. And so you're there, you got a crush on a girl, you want to end up with them, you want your life to come into conformity with them, you want to, as we talked about earlier, you want to be able to adhere to them and be with them. And that interim period is agonizing, it's painful, it's dissonance, it's friction, it's tension. And so most people, what do? They give into despair. They go, you know what, that tension, that's too much. I'm going to start texting another girl. I'm going to pursue this other person. I'm going to occupy myself with those things. Now, if that first girl comes back around, then they're like, all right, cool. The problem is they didn't hope well in the interim. And so that's going to affect their ability to love well, right? Same thing comes with a job, and it's not as important as it is in seeking the person that you want to spend your life with in marriage, but you can at least understand how a lot of people do it. There's a job maybe that they really want. There's one that they really want, and then while they're waiting for they get done with an interview, and it's like, okay, when am I going to hear back? Maybe there's a week, maybe there's a 2 weeks, and you feel sort of anxious. You just kind of feel that bubbling sense of like unease, and so you're like, well, I'll just apply other places. I'll just ignore it. This is you trying to jump off the wheel, the wheel of struggle and dissonance and anxiety, because you're saying, no, that interim space, it's too painful for me. So if I dip out, I'll get an immediate feeling of relaxation, of rest, because you do in the short term. You do, it's like, oh, okay, good, I'm not going after that. But now you've despaired. You've given up on the thing, and this will plague, certainly. This will plague any relationship that comes about where a man despaired in the process through. They will have to pay that debt over and over and over again. And by the way, once you get married, as you know, as I know, you're going to have friction in that marriage, and so you're going to need that virtue of hope, the ability to endure in times where it's uncomfortable.
Right. Which
So
is
hopefully
why,
that.
yeah,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
no, go.
Which is why we've got not only suicide rates high, but divorce as well, because having a good marriage is also being in pursuit of an arduous good. Is tough. You're working against your own fallen human nature, your wife's too, and you get difficult periods, and you have to believe and have the fortitude to stick through them and work towards this thing that you hope for. So I find this topic so interesting because it's really related in my mind to what people talk about as the crisis of masculinity. Something's wrong with men. People are too effeminate. Well, despair is a form of effeminacy because you're not willing to put in the hard work to walk this path of virtue to attain something that's good but tough.
Yeah. Yeah, and what do we mean by effeminacy? I mean, it's a passive action. That's why Kierkegaard actually, so uh, Protestant theologian, philosopher, but his greatest work, Sickness unto Death, he talks about two dimensions of despair, passive and active. So the passive version of despair is to not want to be yourself. And the active version of despair is to want to make yourself a sort of super self. You're gonna fix yourself by yourself. And he says both those are forms of despair. And the second form, the active form, is actually more properly despair, even though your experience of despair might seem to lessen as you're sort of pursuing your own perfection. You're actually more squarely in the boat of despair at that point. But what first happens for most people is they experience the passive form. And so at a certain point, he's actually even going to relate to these as feminine versus masculine, because that's so much baked into what these philosophers, thinkers throughout history are talking about, is that relationship between give and take, between assertion and reception. And it's quite clear, as anyone can model in acts of intimacy and in anything, that the interaction between man and woman is largely typified by that relationship between active and passive. And so this is why, yeah, despair falls in that camp of being fundamentally, feminine, effeminate. If we say that, that's what we're talking. It's a passive. It backs out.
Yeah. Although, let's be clear that feminine and effeminate aren't exact synonyms. When we say that someone
Interesting.
is showing the vice of effeminacy, it means that they're basically put off achieving what they want to because it involves too much difficulty, or they're getting distracted by the pursuit of some other pleasure. So, not sticking to the course. And I think this is really clear when you see guys saying, on the one hand, men do hard things. You hear that a lot online in the secular spheres. People know that men are supposed to stick to what they want and persist through difficulty. And yet, when there's no real motive for that, and this is why I'm interested in what you said about Kierkegaard there, the active form of despair is the idea that you can just fix things by increasing your own willpower. Reminds me of like the Nietzschean Superman. It's like self-help in its ultimate form, right? That you are the one who's going to make everything better without leaning on God.
Yeah. Well, first off, good note about effeminacy. And by the way, didn't know that. So I'm learning something as well here. Yeah, yeah. With Kierkegaard, he really, I mean, really, Sickness unto Death. It can be a slog up front getting through it, but then he throws in good analogies as you get going, And it's really a great, I mean, it's really a great work. And but he says there's three stages in despair. He says the first stage is that you're ignorant that you're in despair. So you've already despaired, you've sort of given up the pursuit of in this case he's talking about like sort of the eternal good of God. You've given up that pursuit because it's too much. You know what? I'd rather live a life where my morals are kind of
Yeah.
just free range. You can do what they want. Like you'll feel an immediate release of tension. That's the draw. That's the attraction to giving up your faith, giving up God. It's like, okay, whew, all right, this is much easier. My conscience feels like, oh, okay, it's come to a rest. Nice and easy. And he says that stage is, and that's going to be the bulk of people. They're going to be ignorant that they're in a state of despair because now they're preoccupied with pursuing job work, money, drugs, sex, any number of things, and they're just satisfied being preoccupied by that for the time. He says, but then what happens is at a certain point, for some portion of people, and he says not everyone, but some portion of people, they become conscious of the fact that they're in despair. And that's then what he says is when starts then those two reactions, the passive form of despair and the active form of despair. And he treats it like, for most people, when they first become conscious of it, it's going to be mixed with that passive form of despair where they no longer want to live. They don't want to live. They want now a relief from the whole experience of being a self and living in this life and God and all these things. And so they just want, or no God, whatever it is, they just want to back out. And he says, what then happens is then a small portion of them move on to that third form of despair. And they then get into the active phase where now they say, I'm going to fix myself. Well, he says the root of despair is this broken connection between you and God, between you and the eternal, because that's where the source of your hope. That's going to be the source of energy that fuels your hope. And so if you get to that last stage where now you're saying, well, I'm going to fix myself, you're still fundamentally cut off from the source of hope. And what he says is most dangerous about that is that now that you're consciously doing that, now that you're consciously cutting off from that and trying to fix yourself, now you're actually less likely to turn away. And in part too, because now you'll start figuring some stuff out. Maybe you start reading some self-help books more and other things, and roughly speaking, your emotional internal life feels like it'll stabilize out more because you're putting some work into it. But now he says, now you're actually in the heart of despair. And I think, I don't know, this is just a gut instinct, but it's like, I think we have a lot of people that it might not be a linear process, that are just jumping to that third stage, then back to the first stage, then to the second stage, then back to the third stage. But in our society, we've got a sort of groundswell movement of like self-help, like I'm gonna perfect myself, and they don't realize like this is the sort of the consummated version of despair.
Right. Interesting. People jumping from the first to the third stage and back again. What I see uniting all the various forms of it, after you really accurately describe that sense of like pressure release that people get. Um, so when they first become aware of despair and then they feel freed from the pursuit of the difficult good to just instead fixate on some things that give them pleasure in the short term, sex, drugs, whatever it might be, that's just a form of idolatry because they're expecting then that that particular created good, that limited good, is going to be able to take the place of God in their lives. Doesn't work out ever in the long run. But the subtler form of it is that some kind of intellectual pursuit or self-help will get the job done. It reminds me of Christ's warning that which of you, by taking thought, can add 1 cubit to his stature.
Mm.
That idea that if we read enough self-help books, then our lives will be what we want them to be. That's everywhere. Most people do fall prey to that now. It's like the essence of liberalism in a way, because if original sin isn't a thing and human nature is fundamentally good and we can create heaven on earth on the mass scale with some kind of political project to reshape society, then makes sense. We can do it in our individual lives, right? That's the assumption. What's stopping
Yeah,
us?
yeah, and I think I'd love to hear a little more from you on this, but I know for me it's like that was that was my experience. Is I find myself in my case maybe it was an abrupt realization of a sort of misery. For other people, it's a sort of creeping sense, and the first thing we do is like, all right, let me read some self help, even if we don't call it that. I mean, it's like now we start doing. I mean, for me, even when I first pursued Christianity, well, I first pursued it to try and debunk it, but then it was like, oh, this is kind of helpful, right? It's that psychological interpretation of Christ, and so you're reading that, and you're like, okay, yeah, this is kind of helpful. Even Christ can be used in that sort of false, self-serving way. Now, by the grace of God, He allows us to come to Him with an imperfect motive, maybe a desire not to go to hell, or the desire to perfect ourselves, which is an imperfect motive. And but God will say, okay, I'm not going to turn you away because your motive's imperfect. I'll perfect your motive too. I think it's relevant for like people wondering about conversions of celebrities. Right now I know there's a lot of chatter about Russell Brand and stuff and what's going on, and it's like, it's wise to take St. Paul's counsel, which is like, no new converts, like try and desist from talking about the faith when you're brand new to it, because it's just a very trying time. But God, the requirement for anyone is not to be perfected in their faith when they come into the faith. You could have any number of motives, and those motives could certainly be impure and imperfect. But God's not sitting there like, oh, your motive's not perfect. Like, I don't want you. No thanks. He's like, no, no, come through the door imperfectly, and now let me work in you. So, I mean, I'd love to hear, yeah, from you. Like, what was your experience with self help? I know with me, my early 20s, like that was a steady diet for me. Was self
Same,
help.
same. Yeah, I've said a few times that when I was late teens, early through mid 20s, I was all about the Nietzschean worldview. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
improve yourself through competition and struggle and embracing hardship and perfect yourself into the Ubermensch, the Superman, right? If you lift more weight,
yeah.
earn more money, develop more skills, etc., etc. And there's some truth to that. The life of virtue that we are going to talk about is about the pursuit of perfection. It is about working those natural virtues so that you can get better and better. The difference is that we can't even keep the natural law perfectly without God's help, let alone develop all the theological virtues as well. Those are called theological, by the way, for people who haven't heard the term before. Theos is Greek for God. So the theological virtues pertain specifically to our relationship to God. So that's why they get that name. And for me, the big distinction was thinking, these are good things. It's good to better yourself. But this worldview that Nietzsche's working within really has no objective standard to be able to say, this is a higher man compared to this man. There's no philosophical grounding for any of these things objectively. So that's when it made no sense to me. And I started looking for something which could actually make sense of that idea that we can progress and get better, but also how to do it. Because we can't just lift ourselves up by our own shoelaces. The problem ultimately is in us. We can't like operate on ourselves with broken surgical instruments, with our limited intellects and our wills, because those are the things that need fixing. That's what we need grace for. So there's a very prideful worldview that I held when I was in my early 20s. And to me, this is it. This is a choice that everyone faces. And it's why Christ versus the Antichrist, as Nietzsche framed it, is the big decision.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Nietzsche too, because yeah, when I say, I was into self-help books, a lot of people think like, pop writers, and that wasn't my cup of tea. But I read the whole corpus of Nietzsche. I read Eastern philosophy literature, and in particular, I really was drawn to Taoism. So you can be into self help and it not be the sort of corny pop psychology self help. That was my version of self help. Was Nietzsche was these types of things. Again, read, if anyone's interested. I mean, actually, probably don't need to encourage toward reading it, but the Tao Te Ching, the works of Chuang Tzu. There's a lot there that'll, like, it's it's deep. It's got some real substance to it. And obviously, those Christian writers of our, sort of 20th century, thinking here of, C.S. Lewis and the abolition of man, things like that. Like they'll note to the sort of the common natural law principles that are there in some portion of this stuff. But yeah, but that's the self-help. We're setting out to do it ourselves. And it's
Mm,
pride. And that's, by the way, that's actually to the Christianity for me, um, was that realization that if you look at the world's religions, the world's leaders, the world's great thinkers, you could objectively differentiate them in their relationship to pride and notably humility. So I would always put it this way: it's like, the Buddha becomes the Buddha. Siddhartha Gautama becomes the Buddha at like roughly age 42, and then he lives that way till 40. And people from all over, the all over the country of India, whatever, the kingdom of India, whatever you call it, would come and visit him, and he was recognized as this really wise man. And it's like, dang, that's a pretty good life. Like if I could have people hold me in esteem and travel from all throughout, as far as the eye can see in both directions, coming to get my wisdom, like you're living a pretty good life. You got pretty good natural sort of like goods there. It'd be easy to sort of crave that. And then Muhammad, it's a similar thing. He rises to power, and then he conquers Middle Eastern Arabian lands, and then he's like a king, warlord, whatever, however you put it. He's that for some 20 years, 27 years, and it's like, okay, again, that's a lot of natural worldly authority, right? And then you have all these other figures, and it's like they come to prominence, and they're these gurus, and then here's Christ, and he comes in, he gives the hard teachings, people are abandoning him, then they have him go so far as to kill him, and he takes it with a humility that's should be mind-blowing to you. I always say, like, when I'm talking to people, I always say, like, you guys, we can all imagine the horror scenario where the feds show up at your house, plant something in your house, now you're arrested. Like, you can't get out of that. Imagine being like innocently arrested for something, and then the authorities just go, well, no, you're guilty of this, and here we seized x number of kilos of cocaine from your house. You can't now go protest to the public and be like, no, I swear it's that. Like, you're screwed. That's a horror scenario. And what happens when Christ is wrongly tried is this man, he's silent, and he's patient. Like I could idealize wanting to do that, but it doesn't take me long to think like, dang, would I have the inner composure to be able to see that through? Not at all. I won't even come close. And then here he is, and forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And then you have all this. It's like, I like, literally, from my perspective, from a secular perspective, looking at them, I said that's an objective difference. And I said this before on podcasts, but if we had 10 world religions where everyone had a sacrificial servant as their leader, as the one who dies, goes to their death, a really ugly, humiliating, gruesome, abandoning death, everyone flees from him. All his like close people are like, I don't know that dude. If we had 10 of those, you're right, it would be super hard to figure out which religion you should belong to. But God so set it up providentially that there's one. We don't have other ones. There's no other in the landscape of religions. There's no other that confronts pride the way that Christianity does. And to me, that alone can be enough to furnish a conviction that it is profoundly different and profoundly useful, because pride is the ultimate enemy. It's the hardest thing. It's the thing most baked into each of us from our fallen nature, but also just by experience. It's the thing that we are most oriented toward, is our self and our self good. And so those saints, I've always said, the saints, the stories of the saints, it's always the stories of their humility. Something they took on that I couldn't imagine taking on.
right.
I couldn't imagine having that humility. And it inspires me. It draws me toward it. It makes me crave that, yearn after that type of humility, that self-denial in the truest sense of it. And that's the thing, right? When we're talking about despair, it's that self-help, which is the operation of pride.
Right.
And what do we do with pride? Because you can fix a lot of virtues through pride, or sort of natural vices through pride. Weight loss, training, discipline in any number of things. You can get that, but that can all be operating as an extension of pride. and the end of that is despair and agony and misery.
You're a former D1 athlete, and you've got not just physical gifts, but intellectual ones as well. And sometimes when you have those kind of things, you're more susceptible to pride than most people are. Like, I haven't done anything that cool, but I was pretty good at sports when I was a kid and had a scholarship based on sports to a fancy school. And I could get into whatever teams that I wanted and did well on exams too. And studies always came pretty easily to me. And I got the idea from that it was just a matter of putting a bit more effort in, and there was nothing I couldn't handle. And then to be confronted with the reality of the limitations of intellect, will, and understanding my own frailty better in all kinds of areas, that was uncomfortable to begin with. But then you realize actually it's more honorable to do that. Humility is just about accuracy. And there's a point at which self-help just becomes delusional, where you're claiming to be able to fix things about yourself that you simply can't. But that's an uncomfortable realization for many people to come to, and they resist it.
Yeah, and they pursue after it. I mean, that was, you said it. It's like any people with any number of talents, you can even make a lot of progress in your self work, which will give you the illusion that you can see it all the way through, and that's where it gets dangerous. But it's a good thing. Though it gets dangerous, it's a good thing to pass through. Like, you should try and work on fixing yourself, and you should run up to that experience of where it is your ability to take yourself ends and where you need help. And sometimes it's not like you, hopefully you don't notice that in the first second you get there. Hopefully you bang your head there for a while being like, well, let me see if I can keep persisting and break down this next level. But I mean, you can't, because fundamentally you won't be able to, because the thing that you're trying to take yourself out of is yourself. You're seeking to transcend yourself, which
Mm.
is it's not going to work.
Yeah.
But for most people, it's like, yeah, they need to it's good for them to experience it, to try it, also to start to build that understanding of what to work on. But when you're young, you imagine that, like, oh yeah, I could perfect myself, and maybe I just haven't tried yet, or maybe I'm
Yeah.
starting to try. But let's see how far I can go, you
Yeah.
know.
And
And it
the core thing
yeah,
is that you can't, because perfection isn't yours to give yourself.
and the beautiful way of putting it too is, you didn't give yourself. So if you don't spring from yourself, how can you give yourself the thing that would fix yourself? It's nowhere near your realm of possibility. But you got to run up against that dead end. You got to bang your head on that dead end, over on that wall, probably a few times. Especially if you're a talented guy. If you're a talented guy, you're really gonna have to bang your head on that wall for a while. Probably rightly so.
Yeah. You might almost have to
And
knock
once you
yourself
realize,
out.
yeah, maybe a few times too.
So
Yeah.
my son came back from his catechism class a while back and said something really interesting. He's like, Dad, the priest said that the crown of thorns, it wasn't just like, a little a wreath that kind of just rested on his head. They were 2-inch thorns, and they got hammered into his skull. And I never thought about it that way before. And he was thinking about what a miracle it is that Christ didn't die before he was actually raised up on the cross. And I've seen a few doctors make that argument as well. Like, it's a miracle he was able to actually get the cross to the top of the hill and then be nailed to it and wasn't already dead. But that bit about the 2-inch thorns nailed into the skull, I think that's about the taking on the sins of the mind, the intellectual, the prideful sins as well. All the different delusions that philosophers have come up with over the years in our pride, like the Gnostic idea that just more knowledge can save us, or we can construct some kind of clever scheme to fix society without God's help. So it's the humbling of man's intellect as well.
Oh man, that's so rich. I can feel that just striking a chord, which is like, oh man, I could think about that for a while. The implications of that. Sometimes you've struck water. It's like you're digging for a well and you've struck water. And it's like that notion that the crown, the thorns in the crown are attacking the pride and the ego, the mind, those things.
The
It's like,
idea that
oh
you can be the Superman, right? You're not the
yeah,
Superman. Nail after nail goes into that idea because we're all susceptible to it. Pride and lust are like the two big things that most guys struggle with, in my experience. Pride, obviously, given that it's the root of all sin, and it's what Lucifer succumbed to precisely because of his great gifts as the highest of the angels. It was pretty easy for him to look at himself and think he was something special.
yeah. Well, and it's fascinating that, and you might even know this, but you're observing of pride and lust, because that's those are the two prongs of the sources of our greatest vice. Those are the things in Thomas's hagiography, sort of recounting of his saintly biography. He was preserved by by a dispensation of grace from God, which is pride and humility,
Yeah.
right? Or, I'm sorry, pride and lust, because lust corrupts the physical side most acutely, most intensely, and pride the spiritual side. And so they'll share the stories for that evidence his preservation from pride, his profound grace to preserve from pride, where he was at university, and students are coming to him about like, hey, we just did a really difficult section. Do you want me to explain it to you? And him being like, yeah, sure. Knowing that he's sorted out everything and whatnot. And he literally allows these kids to tutor him because he's like, he knows like, no, it'll be good for them to try and teach the subject. Like to try and teach the subject will be good for their learning. And then they're there. And there's one time where apparently like the story goes like a student's trying to go through Aristotle's metaphysics. And he gets to a place and he's trying to do it and he can't figure it out. And Thomas, ever so patiently and gently, just kind of shows him the way through it. And it's like the scales fell, and the guy looks at Thomas like, wait, what? Like, you're the smartest. And so it was a short while then, a couple years into it, where that now everyone, professors included, everyone knows that this is the smartest person here, and everyone sort of defers to him. But he was so gentle, he was so humble, he was so, you know what I mean. So, again, by the grace of God, that his intellect wasn't hindered by it. And then you have the story of the parents trying to bring him a hooker into his room, and he no get what I don't remember if he's a hooker or whatnot, but it's like he's preserved on both ends, lust and pride. And that's why it's like, that's the thing, by the way, that's the thing that gave me a devotion to Thomas. It wasn't like how brilliant he is on so many things. It was the realization, as I'm going through the intellectual life, the spiritual life, the religious life, of how much value I gain from curbing even one vice, be it lust, be it food related, things like that. As you even begin to curb it, you realize how much it opens up your intellect. And then I look on Thomas and it's like, oh wow, it's the humility and the preservation from lust that is the actual reason for the sort of pricking of my heart, the piercing of my heart, that gives me that actual devotion to him more than anything.
And that comes back to the point you open with about how that calling to virtue or faith being an important thing to bear in mind. And for some guys, it might just be saying, I'm going to quit porn. Like,
Yeah.
That's bad for you. And when you're doing that, you're also cleaning up your mind too, and opening yourself up to deeper understanding of God as truth, because that's what you're ultimately seeking when you're trying to live better. You're actually clarifying your perception. So we should talk about how this relates to what a human being actually is, because we've said a lot about virtue being the development of good habits and becoming stronger, becoming better human beings. But that presupposes a whole idea of what it is to be a human being. And I said at the start how we're told by most mainstream worldviews now that you're basically just like a monkey in trousers, and you're no different from the rest of the animal kingdom, or that you're just this physical mechanism that does nothing except obey the laws of physics, and science can explain everything there is to know about you, all your deepest secrets. In fact, there aren't really any secrets. It can all be predicted by physical equations. But the philosophers of the past, whether we go back to ancient Greece or the Middle Ages, they all share a view of human beings that is very different from that, and said that there's a couple of things that are special about us that no other animal possesses, namely intellect and free will. And even the most hardline materialist philosophers still talk and act as if they've got free will and intellect. Like they don't deny reason and then give up as they should do, making any kind of rational arguments or writing papers and trying to convince people of viewpoints for reasons.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like there's a research paper type scholarly article that made the rounds like a year ago about a person proposing that we have no free will. It's like, all right, well, why do you have to tell me that? I don't have to tell a dog that they don't have free will. Why are you trying to convince me? Like, right? You're actually assuming the free will in your method of trying to go about and claim we don't have free will. But even that aside, I'm thinking here, Will, I'm thinking about in our prep notes as we started prep for this episode. You mentioned something where the way you put it was something like uh, the ancient philosophers used to be interested in the mystery of what is man, and
Yeah.
now we're interested in just the mystery of the world. I'd love to hear more about that because I think that's so rich. There's so much there.
So, one of the writers that spoke to me most when I was coming out of that Nietzschean phase and considering Christianity was the French scientist slash philosopher Blaise Pascal, and
Oh,
he had this image that I don't know whether people know this when they refer to it, but nowadays you'll hear someone say, "Have you ever gone outside and looked up at the stars? And the universe is just so huge, and there's just you, meaningless and tiny." So Pascal had that exact same thing, writing in the 17th century, but then took it one step further and said, "But I am greater than the physical universe because I contain it and I can think about it. So it's all in my mind, and I'm here wondering about it." So his emphasis, despite being a brilliant physicist and mathematician, all the rest of it, far better than most of the people who idolize science now, he still said that man was the greater mystery. Man was more interesting. The fact that we can even do science in the first place, and the fact that we can fall into despair, that we can have intellectual discussions, we can grasp universals and abstract concepts and know things like 1 + 1 = 2 in all possible worlds. Like, that's the really interesting thing. The fact that we have intellects. So it's the opposite. We're told that by people like Dawkins that nature's so beautiful and mysterious. Actually, human nature has been the main thing that philosophers have been most fascinated by, because a spiritual creature, man, with rationality, is far superior to a mountain or the sea or whatever else it might be from the material world. And that's been lost.
yeah, yeah, and rightfully so. I mean, I'm thinking here how when I first really started studying, the philosophers and Thomas, what the church has to say about human nature. It's like, it's what is that? The Dunning-Kruger effect, where first you
Yeah.
have a lot of success and then you fall down and then slowly you pick back up. It's like when I first get it, I'm like, oh yeah, wow, the immateriality of the soul, and like got it, got all my ducks in a row, figured it out. My five point logical plan of how to explain the immateriality of the soul and all this stuff. And it's like, and then as you reflect on it and a year goes by and another year goes by and you're reading more and you're thinking about it, you're like, oh man, this is like an infinite wellspring. It's so deep. It's so like trying to pin it down. It's like you get closer and it's worth working on. It's not something that's like, unrealizable, but you realize like, oh man, like this is tough. This is the toughest subject there is. And I'll kind of throw this to the audience and to you, Will, is I tell students that I have, I say, I'll ask them every once in a while, what do you think the motive for this person doing this is? And by the way, this is what I preface it with. And by the way, we're doing the guess and check method right now. you have to come to figure out what your motives are for things. Most things that we do are blind to ourselves. So we're gonna have to guess for a while, and then what are you gonna do? You're gonna guess, well, okay, maybe I did that because I was afraid of this thing. It's like, okay, that could be. Does that explain well all the different scenarios that you've entered into a similar behavior? Or do we have to go a level deeper? Was there something that you actually really sort of more actively wanted in it? And then they're like, okay, well, maybe it was this. And then one kid will throw out something. You know, I think it's funny to make fun of a kid. It's actually like really funny. And so I think that's why I did it. And it's like, boom, yes, that's why you did it. Like, you didn't make fun of them because you were afraid you wouldn't be liked. It was because like it gave you a bit of pleasure. Just like any athlete knows, like, to dominate someone in a sport feels really good, right? But
Mm.
now you're exchanging a short-term good for the longer term good. And that's the nature of sin. You're disordering your relationship to others and to the parts in relation to the whole. And so it's like, I say that because it's like, even figuring out about the human mind, we have to piece by piece try and put, sort of the pieces into the right place in the picture. And sometimes it's like we've built up pieces and we're going, okay, I think these good, I think these are good, these fit, these seem to work well. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you have to throw it all out because you've hit a dead end by the route you run. I think this is what happens most of all with Nietzsche, who are the most accomplished of self-help writers. They're the most intellectually, sort of high aptitude. Is they get going, and they're building out a lot. But a good example of this is in modern day pop self-help. They'll throw in these terms. They'll be like, here's your 2 terms for how you're going to view yourself. And these terms are analogies, and they work on a very superficial level very early on. But as you get further up, it's like there's nothing there. But the writer doesn't have the courage to be like, well, I've been working on this for the last year and a half. I'm just going to scrap this and throw it out. But it's like, no, I mean, honestly, you should scrap it and throw it out. And there'd actually probably be a lot of fruits that would come your way if you had the humility to do it. You'd probably gain, 100-fold what you would have otherwise had. But they use those terms, and it's like, well, now you can't. At a certain point, you can't get anywhere, and you actually have to throw those terms out. And it's not because you have to get to the place where there's no terms, as like the sort of Buddhist idea would be. It's that your terms are bad. So
Yeah.
there's just like, there's so much, and we'll spend these last 5 minutes teasing it, talking a little bit about it, but that human nature, figuring out what we are as humans, because there is a lot of substance that you can make, and even make quickly, with these things.
Yeah, so I like what you said there about being disordered in the pursuit of goods, because virtue is really just rational action and sin is irrational action. And by saying that man is the rational animal, we basically mean that he has the freedom to make choices based on what he understands to be good. A tiger or a lion or something is just going to act on its instincts and impulses and not be able to deliberate, not be able to understand. But we can actually participate in natural law, which is like the signature of divine law. So we're participating with God in pursuing what is good for us, which is ultimately Him. And we are built for truth, and God is truth with a capital T. And one of the things that really blew my mind when I was thinking about trying to understand this immateriality of the intellect is, if you take something like your ear, for example, which is so that you can hear, too much sound can be bad. It can make you go deaf. It can even kill you if you're close enough to like a jet plane taking off or something. But because your intellect is immaterial, it's not ever going to get damaged by too much truth, not even infinite truth. So that's what we're ultimately aiming at with God as the beatific vision. We are built for that infinity, but we have to work on the natural virtues first of all, because He wants us to actually participate in that. He'll bring us along further, but we've got to lay the groundwork. And that's basically what the life of virtue is.
Yeah, that's the Aristotelian argument, for the immateriality of the will, is that everything material deteriorates the more that it's used. But here we have this thing that the more truth I know, the more invigorated it is, the more alive it is. So he said that proves that there's something in us that's contrary to the material reality, material nature. Thus, it's immaterial. It's really, I mean, it's an immediately sort of apprehensible argument too, again, comprehensible argument. You can immediately sort of get like, oh, okay, right? And yeah, I always think I want to throw this little nugget in, but it's like animals, if you want to use the term, have some form of like intelligence. They can recognize patterns to a degree. They can
Yeah.
see the harmfulness or usefulness of a thing. Well, Thomas says, one thing in particular that's useful. He says they desire a certain good, but it's a particular good. So it's an individual particularized good. Okay. So they're hungry. They see an animal they want to eat. They're hungry. They go after it. Right. So they're still pursuing a thing under the aspect of wanting that thing, but it's just the particular thing. He says the difference is that a human can pursue a thing under the aspect of its universal good. All right. So okay, so there's this distinction. All right. But now it's like what's really helpful is to then go a level deeper. All right. So we can understand that a thing is good or that it associates to goodness. But most of the time when we're pursuing things, we're not going through that process of thinking in that way. As a matter of fact, most of the time we're probably going to relate to the animal where it's like we see a food we want and we're like, oh, I want that and I pursue it. So it's particular goods. And by the way, really everything that we pursue in this life are particular goods. So the fact that we can see that universal might be sort of hidden from us and hidden from most of us. So I spent a lot of time racking my brain over this, and part of it wasn't even I didn't start I'll attribute this to the Holy Spirit, but it brought me down this path where I'm thinking about my young children. And how old is your youngest?
Uh, 10 months.
Oh, okay. So you're still in the thick of it of having young ones. So we've got a little girl who's a little over 2 years old, and so she's started talking, and she talks in the third person. Her name's Ara. It's hilarious. She talks in the third person. Ara eat banana. Ara eat, like these are her sentences. Ara. So okay, well, what's that telling us? First off, it's telling us something really profound. It's saying that actually the distinction between the human intelligence and animal intelligence emerges right away. And what's that distinction? Well, first off, we are an object to ourselves. Okay, there's no evidence of that in animals whatsoever. Okay, so that's the first thing. Next, you'll notice, what does she have? She has object herself is an object who becomes the subject of the sentence. She's got a verb, eat, and then she's got the receiving object, the thing that's being eaten, banana. Ara eat banana. That's her sentence. So she hasn't yet been able to put sort of time to the verb where it's like past I ate a banana, or I want to eat a banana, or I'm eating a banana, right? But she's got the bare bones structure of it. I kid you not, these reflections have done more for me for understanding grammar than any number of years of schooling and reading stuff. All right, but let me go a step further, because here's what's really amazing as I thought about it more and more is Aristotle. I think one of his most underrated works that's most profound is his categories. The 10 categories, the categoria or something is like the Latin translation of it, but it's the 10 categories: substance and the 9 accidents. All right, quantity, quality, time, place, that puts us at 5, action, passion, posture, habiliment, so things adorning a thing, and then I'm missing one of them. But we've got the substance and the 9 accidents. Okay. Well, what's really amazing, how do we come to understand the universal? It's by understanding a thing in its substance and its accidents, its relation to things. So my daughter, the other thing she does is she says, Ara happy. Ara happy. Or she'll go, Daddy silly guy. Daddy silly guy. And sometimes I don't even do it. She just looks at me and goes, Daddy silly guy. And she just starts laughing. It's so cute. But so that's a quality. She's literally observing a quality in relation to a thing, like, yum, banana tastes good, banana good. Okay, this is the actual worthwhile distinction. We see it right there in the earliest stages that the human mind is ordered towards seeing the substance and the nine accidents. That's what it means to see a thing in its universal aspect. No matter how much language training you give to an animal, a monkey, they can identify an object. They can't tell you anything about it. They can do none They can do none of the accidents, none of the 9 accidents. So they cannot see the thing under its universal aspect. I kid you not, this has been more fruitful for my reflections on what it means to be human, what it is that we have, how this is an immaterial faculty. It's not an extension of just having more neurons and a stronger memory or whatever. Again, whatever the modern materialists argument for human intelligence is. I'm sorry, that alone deconstructs it, the categories, the substance and the 9 accidents, how we are inclined to see things in that way,
Right.
right? We are inclined to see things from the earliest time that we start to use language, and no animal does any of it. It's not like they see it in like a diminished sense. They literally cannot see the substance. They cannot see the accidents related
No,
to a
not at
thing.
all. And Mortimer Adler made this point in his research on animal intelligence as well, that only humans have syntactically patterned speech. Like he's just observing as an Aristotelian. Let's look around at dolphins and so called smart animals like apes. None of them have syntactically patterned speech. And they don't refer to concepts like truth or justice or beauty. They don't involve universals in their speech whatsoever. Nor do they do things like make tools for future use based on blueprints that show an understanding of the tool in the abstract, divorced from any particular application of it right now. So what you're observing there in your daughter is the same thing at work. So that's great
Yeah, yeah,
evidence for the immateriality of the mind, which of course means that it's immortal as well, because if it's not material, it's not composed of parts, it can't disintegrate. So a lot follows from this, which is why these
yeah,
people would rather deny their own rationality, which is what consistent materialists end up doing, and deny their own free will, than accept what the actual logical consequences of it are, which basically mean that you're into the full-blooded worldview that man, after all, is the rational animal. He has an immortal soul, and that didn't evolve from matter via purely material processes. And then you've opened up the philosophical framework for classical theism and God, and then you're not too far away from Christianity at that point, because something like the resurrection, against that philosophical foundation, you've got no good arguments against it anymore.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I think by us beginning to at least preliminarily lay that out for people, give them those major notes, it's like this actually serves to be the antidote to the despair that we're talking about. Is now
Right.
you can start to keep the ball rolling. You can actually start pursuing it. You can actually start to regain that hope for hope and
Yep.
the hope itself.
For sure.
It's like, okay, all right, now we can realize that, all right, there is something higher, there's something more profound that we can pursue, and that we should continue trying to pursue the perfection of our vices, of our attachments.
Yep.
That Buddhist terminology is really attractive to people because it's sort of instinctive. It's like, oh yeah, I'm attached
Yeah.
to smartphone, to drinking socially, to using drugs, to masturbation, to whatever it is. It feels like an attachment. It feels like a monkey on our back,
Yeah.
as
Yeah. Yeah.
people always use that image. And it's like okay, so you're trying to break those attachments. Like, yeah, good. The real question becomes why, right?
Yeah.
Why? Why are you trying to break those attachments? The Buddhist answer, the the way people approach it now is something like, well, because then when I don't have the attachments, then I'll feel free. It's like, okay, but again, why?
Mm.
Who cares? Who cares? Why not just throw more monkeys on your back?
And
Like,
it's so good because
monkeys are cool.
um, Christ doesn't take away the struggle or the suffering that people resonate with in that Nietzschean worldview. You do have to work. You do have to fight. The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence. Only he who fights will wear the crown. So you do need to put all that effort and work in. And he doesn't want to make it so you just sit back and you get fixed without any effort from your natural will. So anything that appealed to you as like a masculine quest and a goal to strive for within that secular self-help framing, it's still there in Christianity to the extent that it's true, because all truth is Christ's. The lives of the saints are heroic struggles after virtue. And the holier they get, the more God allows the devil to tempt them. So they've got more to prove themselves with. If you use a gym analogy, it's like if you've been lifting 10 years and you're deadlifting a lot, guess what? You're going to have to lift heavier weights than the next guy to carry on making progress. So in the life of St. Anthony, for example, the holier he becomes, the more his trials ramp up, the tougher it gets. God gives Satan even more free reign on him. But the difference is, he doesn't say pridefully, I am defeating Satan myself. Through his humility, he realizes he doesn't have to be afraid, and then he can work with God to be able to get through it.
Yeah, it's like as you progress in that spiritual life, the more you turn to the humility, the more instinctively you start, more habitually you start
Yeah.
to turn to it. It's like, you're constantly like deferring it over. And it's worth noting, like, pride is an inordinate desire for one's own excellence. Well, what makes it inordinate is that you want uh credit for being the cause of it when you're not, or you're not
Yep.
fully the cause of it. You want you want like not to not share with others the success that's come about, or in the worst case, you take credit for something that you literally didn't do. Okay, so if those are the three aspects, you as to the cause of your excellence, you're inordinate toward the cause, where you don't recognize God, or you don't recognize what came to it. As to it's the experience of the excellence, you don't want to share with others who are part of it, or share it with God, or you want to take credit for something you didn't do at all. Those are the three parts. So humility is going to antidote those three parts.
Yep.
Fundamentally, like, the working definition of humility is going to be that you recognize rightly the source of the cause of any excellence that you have. You share it with those who have participated, and you never take credit for something that you didn't do. You adamantly, whoa, hold on, you got that wrong. Like,
Yeah.
not me there. I want to throw this last one for people, because I just think it's such a valuable quote, and I've kind of mishmashed them together now. But 2 years before I became Catholic, I read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And if anyone in the audience has read it, awesome. If you haven't, that's fine too. But there's an opening scene, first 100 pages or so. They go to this monastery, and this conversation between, all the brothers are there, and the father who hasn't yet been killed. That's not a spoiler alert, because that's the main plot point of the novel, is that the father hasn't died yet, and they're all having this conversation. There's these monks here, and the father, Fyodor Karamazov, is belligerent, and he's going at these monks, mocking them, just going hard. And the monks, they give these little one-liners back that are just gems. And they say, "Suffer with joy the dishonor that providentially befalleth thee, and be not angry, nor hate him who dishonoreth thee. But recognize," and I think this is where I blend it together, "but recognize it is the medicine from Jesus sent to cleanse your vain soul. So shall we do." And then they just kind of continue, and they continue on and keep having the conversation, then rips on them again more. I mean, just like ruthlessly rips on them. And they basically say the same thing again. "Suffer with joy the dishonor that providentially befalleth thee," so that God ordained to come your way at this time, "and be not worried, nor hate the one who's dishonoring you," right? But recognize that it's the medicine of Jesus sent to cleanse your vain soul. That stuck. When I read that, I still return to that same quote, the concept of that quote, which is, when my pride feels aggravated, it's displeasing, but I go, "Oh, this is the medicine of Jesus.
Mm.
Jesus is trying to cleanse my vain soul." But I'm experiencing it as pain, first off. So now here I am, 8, 9 years on, and it's like, I've habituated to it much
Yeah.
more. So I much more quickly turn to the humility, and by the grace of God, I hope that one day it's with the speediness that the saints, did it and do it. Um, but it's been so beneficial to be like, "Oh, dang!" Like, when I'm pushing back, when I'm in an intense argument with my wife, or whoever it would be, a friend, and I feel it flaring up, and it's like, "Oh, okay." By
Mm.
the way, that doesn't mean every argument is off the table, or that every time you get intense that it's that happening. But I can feel it. It's the thought of something. What if this person
did this to me, or this person insults me, or this thing, and it's
Yeah.
kind of like, or they bring up something shameful of my past, and you feel it trigger, and it's like, oh, okay, that's that vanity. That's the medicine of Jesus, right?
Yep.
But most of us don't receive it as medicine. That itself is insightful. It's like we don't receive the grace of God as grace. We're like, I'd rather not have your grace, thank you. You know,
we should
yourself, please, thank you.
we should definitely have a look at why suffering is good for us in a future episode, because the idea that suffering is just something that we want to stop and run from, and like we said earlier, try to find something palliative or something to numb ourselves, anesthetize ourselves. That's it, whether it's pills or the pursuit of some kind of inferior pleasure. That's what people go for. But the idea that you seek out suffering because it's good for you and it's going to help transform you, that's what the Christian tradition is about, whether it's fasting, penance, mortification, whatever it might be. So let's do something on that in future. It's been a really rich first episode. I think we've laid down a ton of concepts here that we can flesh out in future ones. And
Yep.
I'm really grateful that you agreed to go ahead with this project. I think everyone's going to benefit a lot from it.
Yeah, same to you, Will. I really, really appreciate it. I'm really glad we're getting this going.
All right, awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. We'll be here same time next week, Friday as well. So see you then. Take care, guys. And this will be on Substack as well. And you can get my work there and AJ's as well. Take care. God bless.
God bless.